Thank you for joining this session and for attending the Citrix Converge 2021 conference. It would have been nice to have this conference in person. I don't know about you, but I'm ready for some in-person conferences again. My name is R Faulkner, and I'm an Enterprise Solutions Architect for Conversant Group, located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've been working in the end-user computing arena for over 25 years now. I first got started with Citrix with WinFrame 1.7, so I've been doing this a long time. While I have done breakout sessions in the past, this is the first time I've done one covering any kind of application scripting, so I am outside of my comfort zone. As this is a recorded session, please use the Q&A part of the platform to list any questions you might have, and I will answer them when this presentation is played live. Today I'm going to be talking about and demonstrating the Citrix Automated Configuration Tool. I'll cover what it is, when you should use it, and then do a screenshot walkthrough of a basic export and import. What I will cover today only scratches the surface on what this tool is capable of, and I encourage you to get very familiar with it if you see migrating to the Citrix Cloud in your future. I do wonder if Citrix has the ability to use any other kind of icon. It's not confusing at all to have this tool installed on my delivery controller, where I have Citrix Studio, Scout, and Director, all of them using the same icon. First thing we're going to talk about is what is the tool. Citrix has found that one of the barriers holding people back from migrating from on-premises deployments to the cloud was the sheer number of applications, desktops, policies, etc. that larger customers had to migrate from the on-premises to cloud. For that reason, they developed a tool that would read the current configuration of the environment, export these settings, and import the settings into the new cloud control plane. Once the tool was developed, there were recommendations that it be permitted to also do things like cloud-to-cloud copies, for test and dev to production, etc., and to permit a backup of an existing site that could be restored later. If you're going to be using the AutoConfig tool to migrate your environment, it is recommended that you have some familiarity with a few items. First, you should be familiar with setting up and administering a Citrix virtual apps and desktops. Second, you should be proficient with the Yet Another Markup Language, or YAML, standard. And finally, you should know how to use PowerShell and how to properly syntax your commands. As with any other application, there are prerequisites that must be met first. At first, your virtual apps and desktops on-premises setup must be in the current release or its immediate predecessor. It can also be one of the supported long-term server releases that are still supported by Citrix as well. You will need to access an on-premises delivery controller and at least one on-premises virtual desktop agent. The machine running the tool must have .NET Framework 4.7.2 or later. And finally, the Citrix PowerShell SDK must be installed. If you're running the tool from the delivery controller, this is already installed for you. Prior to performing the import, there are some prerequisites you will need as well. The machine you are running the tool from will obviously need access to Citrix Cloud. You will have to have a Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop Service provisioned. The resource location you have must have at least one connector provisioned, and it needs to be joined to the same domain as your on-premises setup. Finally, the device you are running the tool from must be able to reach the Citrix Cloud Services plane. If needed, there is a listing on Citrix documentation website of what service addresses you will need access to. The objects that can be imported are listed here. These objects are also listed in dependency order. When performing the import, you must import each of these objects in order to ensure that the required dependencies are in place before the next item is imported. If a dependency is missing, the following object will not be imported. For example, if the machine catalog does not exist, any delivery groups that rely on that catalog will not import. Since we can merge these objects, it's okay to run the tool multiple times, adding a few new items each time the tool is run. There are some known limitations you will need to keep in mind. First, and probably the most important, is that we cannot import machine catalogs provisioned through machine creation services. At first glance, you might be tempted to say, why use the tool at all? The good news is, you can import the other objects in your site without impacting it. You can manually create the machine creation services catalogs ahead of time, and then work on importing the configuration. Make sure the new machine catalog name matches the current on-premises name, and yes, it is case sensitive. Then, when you're importing the delivery groups, the machines will be assigned to the delivery group, saving you the time of importing those machines. If you have custom icons set for applications or desktops in your environment, these cannot be imported either. You will need to modify the desktops or applications manually after importing them to change the icon. There are 3 special files that will be created using information you will gather and input. These are the customer info file, the zone mapping file, and the CVAD AC security file. To use the tool, you will need to have a way to authenticate the tool with your Citrix Cloud account. This is accomplished by gathering and generating a few items in the Cloud console. The first of these is the customer ID. Then you will create a client ID, and the secret key will be generated for you. You will need these 3 items to create the CustomerInfo.yml file. To gather your customer ID, you will need to sign into your Citrix Cloud account. Select the Identity and Access Management from the hamburger menu in the upper left side of the page. The customer ID is located on the Identity and Access Management page under the API Access tab. You can see it blurred out here. On that same tab, we're going to start the next portion of this by entering a client name in the box and then selecting Create Client. The client ID and the secret will be generated based on what you entered. You will need these later, so you can copy them into a safe place or download the CSV file and save it for later. You will see the listing of your client on the website. Be careful, the secret key cannot be viewed again once you have completed the previous step. If you do not remember the key, you will need to delete the client and then create a new one following the process we just went through. Now that we have gathered all of the information, we will populate the customer info file. A common mistake here is to try and modify the CustomerInfo.yml directly. It is highly recommended that you use the PowerShell command to generate the file. You will need the customer ID, the client ID, and the secret key from the previous sections. The PowerShell command is new CVAD AC customer info file, and it looks something like this. I'm not going to try and read the client ID or the secret. That's just not me. You can use the set CVAD AC customer info file command to modify only the customer ID in the CustomerInfo.yml file. If you need to modify more items than that, you will need to rename the current file and go back and create a new one. This is an example of a CustomerInfo.yml file. There are a few other items that are available to be configured here. You can add the editor line as seen here to choose which editor it launches to view your results. It defaults to Notepad EXE, but you can pick your favorite editor like Notepad++. Now we will work to gather the information for the zone mapping file. You will need to get any zone names from your on-premises environment by opening Citrix Studio. That is one fine looking icon, right? Then expand your configuration and select zones on the left side of the screen. Your zone names will be listed as shown in this picture. Make sure you note them, and yes, they are case sensitive. Next, we're going to go back to the cloud, and we're going to go and find the cloud resource locations. You get them by clicking the hamburger icon and selecting Resource Locations. In this screen, you'll see the resource locations that are associated with your cloud site. You need to copy this name as well. The default is pictured here and is My Resource Location. Once again, this information is case sensitive and must include the spaces between the words. The next file we will need to configure ourselves is the zonemapping.yml. It will look something like this. The left column is the name of the zones as they appear in your on-premises environment. The right column is the name of the cloud resource locations. There must be a space between the colon and the resource location. If there are spaces in the zone or the resource location, you will need to enclose them in brackets so they can be read properly. The host security file contains the information required to log the tool into the different hosting environments available to the AutoConfig tool. It will look something like this for a site that has access to both an on-premises Zen server and an API connection to an AWS resource location. I would be remiss if I did not point out that this data would not be something that you would want anyone to get access to. It is recommended that you maintain this file in a secured location. Now we will do a walkthrough of the steps to migrate from an on-premises deployment to a cloud deployment. A high-level view of what will need to be done looks something like this. First, you must install the automated config tool. You can then export the information from your on-premises environment. One thing to keep in mind, the export will create the basic customer info, zone mapping, and host security YAML files. These you will need to modify before you can continue. Log into the Citrix Cloud site and gather the security info we discussed earlier. Using that information, populate the CustomerInfo.yml, the zonemapping.yml, and the host security.yml files. Then you are ready to import the on-premises data to the cloud. The tool does allow you to import only certain sections, as well as to merge the data, so existing cloud configuration is not lost. Of course, the first thing you must do is install the autoconfig file. This is best done on a delivery controller, since you will need the Citrix Studio commands and the config, as well as the autoconfig tool. You can install them on any PC or server that you wish to, but you'll need to make sure that you install Citrix Studio as well. After the installation, you'll see the autoconfig icon on your desktop. If you double-click the autoconfig icon, it will open a PowerShell commandlet window with all of the commandlets required for the autoconfig tool already loaded inside it. Then you're going to execute the export-cvadac to file command. This command is going to read your info from the on-premises environment, and it's going to create several YML files with that information inside there. Every time you execute the commands in here, there is going to be a history file that will get updated, so you can see when, what time, and if there were any errors that occurred. Once it is completed, it will also open up a notepad. And when you run the command, the process looks something like this. It will take a little while for all of the different lines to complete, and you should see successful completions on every one of the steps. If you do not, you can open up the history file and see where there were problems. As I stated before, when it's completed, a notepad file will open up. It looks something like this. It will have in it the details of what it did during the execution of the command and what the results were for each of those steps. You should review the file to make sure whether or not there were any problems. If there were, you can go back and fix those problems and then rerun your export. The completed file structure will look something like this. As I mentioned before, the history file keeps a log of each time you ran a command and what the results were. It's also going to create a new folder structure with the results and the data inside it. As you can tell from the folder structure, it's going to be indicating whether or not it was an import or an export command, and it does date and time the occurrence of that particular command. There will be a subfolder of the action, date, and time, as I mentioned previously. The key files in here will be the results log that displayed upon completion, the exported PowerShell commands list, and the fix-up checklist. You'll also see a copy of any YML files that were modified copied over here so that you have a backup of them before the command was run. The PowerShell exports file will show the commands that were run to export the information from your on-premises environment. And the fix-ups file shows the errors that were experienced and any recommended steps to be taken following the action. In an export, there's really not a lot to see. It does alert you to the fact that your cvadac security.yml file will need to be updated. This is where you will list the credentials required to access your hosting environment. You'll also annotate whether it's VMware, Citrix Hypervisor, Nutanix, Hyper-V, Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud. As you can see, we can have a security file for any of the supported Citrix Cloud infrastructures. Running the merge cvadac to file command will merge all of your data that was exported into your cloud configuration. It will also launch a log file in Notepad upon completion so that you can take a look through it to see what may not have been successful. This is a merge action, not an overwrite, so any existing data in your cloud environment will not be overwritten. You can then see the results of your import. You can see from this example that the connection information on the left was added to the cloud, and it did not overwrite the existing connection information. So now we have two different connections to two different VMware environments. You will also see that the delivery groups are imported. There are a couple of items I would like to call your attention to in this screen. First, note that the engineer desktop was imported, but the Office desktop was not. If you remember when I talked earlier, I said if the machine catalog is using machine creation services, it will not be imported, so you must manually create the catalog. In this instance, I had manually created the engineer desktop machine catalog, but did not create the Office desktop machine catalog. So I was only able to import the one delivery group. Additionally, if you'll take a look at the icon next to the cloud delivery group for the engineer desktop, you will notice that it is in maintenance mode. This permits you to aggregate your resources for on-premises and cloud at the same time. That way, the delivery group will not overwrite the one that's on the premises side. You will control which one is in maintenance mode and which one is actually being utilized later in other commands that we can talk about. But this allows you to have the machine catalogs and the delivery groups match on both sides without causing any major issues. There are some other useful commands that I would like to point out. The first of these is the sync cvad AC to site command, which performs an export and an import in one step. There are entries that can be made in the CustomerInfo.yml file to make this command and the others not launch the results file and run silently so that you can push the configuration remotely or on a schedule. You must already have the customer info, zone mapping, and host security YAML files configured for this command to work. This command can also be used if you have test, dev, and production sites to sync the information between each of these sites. You can back up the site using the backup cvad AC to file command, which exports your current configuration to YAML files. Then there's the restore cvad AC to site command, which restores the cloud to the previous configuration using the latest restore files. You can also use compare cvad AC to site to compare your on-premises YAML files to the existing cloud configuration, producing a report of what changes that will be made by an import, merge, or restore commandlet. The get cvad AC customer sites command will list out all of the sites in a customer's configuration so we can see what information will need to be gathered. Some other useful commands I would like to talk about are the set cvad AC site active state for both the on-prem and the cloud. You can use these commands when you are in the process of migrating from the on-premises to the cloud sites and you are using the cloud to aggregate your resources. This will determine if the appropriate application or desktop uses the on-premises or the cloud version. Executing the command with no parameters places the site into maintenance mode. Executing the command with the -site active parameter takes all the delivery groups out of maintenance mode. If you remember earlier, I showed you that the desktop group was in maintenance mode. We would want to use this if you are going to have testing occurring after hours so that I could set the cloud active after hours and the on-premises as maintenance mode after hours. And then once we were done with our testing, I can then reverse those commands so that I'm back to on-premises in the morning when everybody needs to work and the cloud is back in maintenance mode. Once you get used to the power of this tool, it opens up many different capabilities for you and your cloud migration. First, it gives you the ability to test the commands ahead of time, showing you how each would change items without actually changing them. The tool also offers the ability to select which components are included on a component basis. In addition to that, you can filter by object names on both an include or an exclude basis. So you can include the certain applications, but exclude those that are in a particular site. I think you have a good idea now of the power of this tool and the commands that it is executing. Thank you for attending the session, and I hope that you have found it very informative. We're now going to open the floor to those questions as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. If you would like to reach out to me afterwards, you can see my information here. I can be reached at richard.faulkner@conversantgroup.com. I also invite you to please connect with me on LinkedIn and be /Richard Faulkner Jr. And let's connect up on Twitter at RJ Faulkner JR. Thanks again, and have a good day.